All right, let's start over. Hey, everybody. Welcome to your Unbook Show on this Saturday night. I hope everybody's doing well. I think it's Saturday. I have to say that my whole conception of time and dates and what hour it is during the day and what's going on has been completely messed up by by jet lag. By I left Seoul, South Korea at 10 a.m. I think it was around 10 a.m. Thursday morning. And I arrived in New York at 9 a.m. Thursday morning. So it was actually time travel. I actually gained an hour by traveling 12 hours. Anyway, it's very confusing. But and then of course I flew into the past, as Catherine says, and then of course I had a layover in New York for I don't know 6 hours I think, and then got on another flight from New York to Brazil. The whole thing is over 30 hours, so I'm a little discombobulated. Is that a word? Something like that. Anyway, I am in Sao Paulo. It's the first thing you notice when you step out of the plane in Brazil is nobody's wearing masks, which is so different than Korea and Japan, where everybody is wearing masks. I mean, everybody, and where everybody's wearing masks, and they're wearing masks indoors and outdoors. So mask wearing is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Even people just walking in the street, even if they're alone, it's quite striking. Here in, of course, once you land in the U.S., you walk out. Very few people are wearing masks in the airport. Once you get to Brazil, almost nobody is wearing masks anywhere in the airport, outdoors, indoors, anywhere. So it is. It is interesting. It's one, I guess, aspect of the many differences between uh, Brazil and Asia. In many respects, one can't think of cultures that are more different, Brazil and Asia. So it is interesting. I got a lot of comments when I posted this on Twitter asking, well, how does I wonder where people died more of COVID. Well, I mean that's pretty clear that Brazil had more excess deaths from COVID than Asia. Asia had very few, particularly South Korea and Japan, that did a very good job of tracing, contact tracing in the early days of the pandemic. So they really shut down the disease without locking down their societies. They really shut down the disease in terms of infecting large numbers. So they got control of this much better than people did in the West without the kind of draconian measures that were done in the West. And they wear masks, and at the margin, masks reduce getting COVID. So far fewer deaths in Japan and in South Korea than in Brazil, for whatever that's worth. And South Korea and Brazil, because they didn't really shut down during COVID, didn't suffer the kind of economic consequences that many countries in the West did from lockdowns. They didn't lock down. They were much better about isolating pockets where the infection was being transmitted, and in a sense isolating them from the rest, or locking down only the people who seemed to have it. They were better at testing, and they were better at isolating. And then Japan, and I think this is true of Korea, but certainly in Japan, vaccination rates are very, very high. So COVID is really, very few people have had COVID in Japan and Korea. There's very little natural immunity from actually having it. But the fact that they wear masks today is absurd and ridiculous. The variants of COVID right now are not life-threatening for almost anybody. And outdoors, it never made any sense to wear masks outdoors. What was interesting, that there was a thing where everybody was getting a picture taken, and I was there, and I was not wearing a mask, and everybody else was standing around me with masks, and I said, "Take your masks off." And they were so embarrassed to take their mask off. It's almost like the mask has become a way, particularly I think for the girls, for the women to hide behind, right? So this one girl took off the mask and she had braces on, and she kept covering her mouth so you couldn't see the braces, and it was like the mask has now become a tool of almost fashion, or a tool of concealment, or a tool of, if you don't have the mask on, they feel a little embarrassed. It's kind of, Jennifer says, kind of a security blanket. And I think it is. And particularly for teenagers, I think it's a way of covering up. So it's, in that sense, it's spooky. On the other hand, if you compare, so Brazil doesn't have any of that. Brazil, none of that exists. But Brazil, of course, I was out after my event yesterday. I'll talk about the event in a minute. After the event, I was out calling an Uber, and I had my phone in my hand, and I was out on a main street in Sao Paulo, and I was kind of putting in the stuff that you put in an Uber, and a number of people came up to me, people from the conference, people I know, and said, "Don't do that. Hold on to that phone really, really tight." Because in Sao Paulo, it's known that if they can see your phone, somebody will jump out of the car, grab your phone, run into the car, and escape. So, and this, I know this from years ago when I was in Porto Alegre, at a hotel in what looks like a very affluent area, very safe area. But everybody says, don't take your phone out. Keep your phone deep in your pocket. Keep your phone somewhere where they can't see it. They will grab your phone and they will run away. They will steal your phone. So Brazil is a place where phone jacking, is that a term? Phone jacking, but generally crime is very, very high. So now in Brazil, when I have my phone and I'm calling an Uber and everything, I'm holding it very, very tight, and I'm very, very careful. People don't grab and take your phone in London. Nowhere near the rates I've seen. I've never seen people really pickpocketed in London, whereas I've seen people pickpocketed in Rio de Janeiro. Literally kids pickpocket and run away. Crime is, if you look at the statistics, Brazil has a very, very high level of both property crimes in terms of theft and violent crimes. The story in Japan and Korea is you could basically put your iPhone on the pavement and walk away and come back an hour later, and it'll be exactly where you left it. Stuff is completely and utterly safe. In Asia. So that is pretty. It's pretty amazing. I talked to a lot of Americans who live, particularly in South Korea, attracts a lot of Americans, Australians, Brits, Canadians, who go there to teach English and then like it and they stay. And you ask them, why do they stay? And a big reason is that life there is so comfortable. The places are clean, the public transportation runs on time, and is efficient and effective. You can get everywhere. You live at a pretty high standard of living. The technology is good. I mean, the quality of the internet, for example, in Korea was outstanding. And it's super safe. You can walk around any time of night or any place or anywhere. You don't have to think about the neighborhood you're in or anything like that. And you are fine. And I think to a lot of people that sense of safety, that sense of calmness, that sense of the wealth is all very attractive. And while somebody mentions traffic, while traffic is really bad in those cities, a lot of the people don't drive. So if you avoid driving, and given that the subway system, particularly in Japan, is super efficient, you can get anywhere. Without any problem. James says, I recommend a book called The Future is Asia by Parangkana. He makes great references on why the future will be Asian, and population is one reason. But population is the exact reason why Asia is in deep trouble. Asian population generally is going to start shrinking if it hasn't already shrunk. Korea has the lowest birth rates in the world at under 1.85. It has the oldest population on the planet. Japan is a little better at, I think, 1.2 birth rates, and they're shrinking. China might see a reduction in population between 30 to 40% in the next decade or two. You might have, I'm not sure what the situation is in places like the Philippines or Indonesia and Malaysia, but at least the more advanced countries, the wealthier countries, Taiwan, China, Japan, South Korea, have massively shrinking population. Even India is seeing birth rates tumble dramatically, and with the potential of those birth rates going below replacement. So you've got a massively aging population in Asia. So just on the basis of population, I would say that it's going to be hard for them to be the future. And then, of course, you do have these challenges of collectivism. The mask is, I think, an illustration of that. Collectivism and conformity. You do have the challenges of authoritarianism in China, and you start really being challenged around Asia really being the future. I used to think that, but the more yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm distracted by some of the questions coming in. I doubt that you're going to see significant, huge growth in Asia because of that. Again, unless there are countries out there that have populations increasing, but those are not the countries that have been at the forefront of Asian economic and political growth. Jennifer asks, these are just Asian-related questions. Do you think emotional repression is common in Japan? Do you think they have trouble forming intimate relationships? I don't know. Again, I'm exposed to, I think, the Japanese who don't. They don't give off a sense of emotional repression. These are Japanese that are interested in objectivism, and they tend to be, quite good and not necessarily. Anyway, the emotional repression doesn't seem to be there, but you do get a sense, and this was certainly in Korea. You don't get much response from them. They're a difficult audience. When you lecture in front of them, there's not a lot of response. There's not a lot of emotion. There's not a lot of asking questions, but that is more, they don't want to stand out. If one person asks a question, like in many places, this is also true in the Midwest and in Scandinavia, once the first person asks questions, others do. And then after the lecture, they'll come up and say how much they enjoyed it and so on. But you don't get a lot of emotion on their faces, particularly with masks on, from it. Now, the lack of marriage, the lack of romantic relationships, the lack of sex that that supposedly exists in this country might suggest that there is a lot of emotional repression. There was that movie about the Japanese guy, he's married, but on the way back from work, he starts taking dance lessons, and that helps him come out of his shell and get out of this emotionally repressive. It was an excellent movie. I thought it was really well done and really powerful and could apply to a lot of different cultures, not just Japanese. So there is some emotional repression in that part of Asia, not just in Japan. Certainly in Korea is very similar. I could tell just in kind of the interacting I had with young people in Korea that, again, there was just, you talk to them and some of them are nodding, but there's very little emotion. They don't ask questions. So there certainly is a level of emotional repression in both cultures. On the other hand, they'll come up to you, they'll say how much they enjoyed something, they'll engage. So, like everywhere, it depends on the person, but also it depends on the context. And I don't know enough about kind of their intimate lives, their personal lives, the way in which they live their lives to be able to really tell you how repressed it all is at that level, right? In terms of intimate relationships, I just don't know. I just don't know. The reality is that they're not getting married. When they get married very late. They're not having kids. And again, based on survey data, based on all this research, and this is generally globally, not just in Asia, but particularly I think in Asia, they're not having that much sex. So I also read somewhere that, in both countries, Korea and Japan, although in Japan it's more on the surface and in Korea it's more suppressed, prostitution is very prevalent. That is, Korean men and Japanese men use sex workers quite frequently. I don't know how that relates to Western countries, but the numbers seemed very, very high. And that would fit into repression and not kind of really committing to intimate relationships. So using prostitutes as a replacement for intimacy. Anyway, there's a lot. We've talked about this. Daniel says prostitution should be legal. In many respects, I think it is legal in Japan, or at least aspects of prostitution, maybe not full-on prostitution, but where it is not in Korea. That's why I said in Japan it's more on the surface, in Korea it's more underground. All right, so yeah, we can talk a lot more about Asia, and I'm sure we will in the future. Asia is an important part of the world, and a lot of stuff is going to be happening there, particularly because of China, and we'll be talking about China a lot. And we can talk a lot about the culture. We can talk a lot about the culture in Asia as opportunity, as we have opportunity to do so. Quickly, an update on Puerto Rico. As you know, Puerto Rico was hit by a hurricane. My wife was there alone, which was not the plan. Lesson learned: don't leave home during hurricane season or the peak of hurricane season, which is September. But it's been rough, as you know, you probably from the news. Probably Puerto Rico, a significant portion of Puerto Rico does not have electricity. Certainly, our neighborhood does not have electricity, so we are running off of a generator. That is always risky with the generator. The generator can break. There is now potentially a shortage of diesel to run generators. The internet has been in and out because the internet company relies, of course, on electricity. And also it has substations that got hurt by the wind, so they're trying to fix their system. So the internet has been surprisingly good given the hurricane, but still in and out. The elevators in our building broke down. It's been a rough ride for Puerto Rico and for my wife in Puerto Rico. So yeah, September is not a good time for me to be traveling. Probably a good time not to be in Puerto Rico. So maybe both of us should not be in Puerto Rico during September. We will see. Also, so yeah, it's rough. It's rough. Let's see, what else do we have in terms of just catching up? Yeah, so let's see. Yesterday we had an all-day conference it was 2 days. It was Thursday and Friday. We had a 2-day conference in Sao Paulo on objectivism. I was there. Tal Tzfani, the CEO of the Iron Institute, was there. Aaron Smith and some others were there. Uh, we Yeah, you know, we had a good attendance. I think it was over 100 people who were there. Brazilians in Sao Paulo, who came from a number of different places around Brazil. It was a lot of fun. Brazil is, you know, if Asians are repressed, Brazilians are the other way around. Wow, Vadim, thank you. That is amazing. Vadim just gave $300. I really, really appreciate that. With a question, so we'll get to the question in a little bit. So Brazilians are very vibrant, very warm. You know, it's very easy uh, to lecture in front of Brazilians. It's very easy to do Q&As with Brazilians. They always have questions. They jumping up and down. They get excited. It's a lot of fun. Brazil generally is a fun place to be, in spite of the high levels of crime, and that you have to grasp your cell phone really, really hard, and you have to watch it. But the conference was fantastic. It was a lot of fun. You know, I think there's a lot of energy in Brazil around Ayn Rand. There always has been. I've been coming here for now what, over 10 years, about 10 years, and there seems to be a real vibrancy. It's also true that in Brazil, there's Ayn Rand is quite popular. A lot of the businessmen in Brazil, both the very successful ones, the very, very wealthy ones, and the younger ones, have all read Atlas Shrugged. There were a number of businessmen organizations all over Brazil, in different cities around Brazil, where Fountain and Atlas Shrugged are kind of required reading, and everybody reads them, and they have study groups and they talk about it. So there's a real energy around Ayn Rand and around objectivism in Brazil that is unmatched, really, in any other country in the world, I think, and just in terms of the extent, the prevalence. Yeah, so I'll be traveling to two more cities in Brazil. On Monday, I will be in Curitiba. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And then in Porto Alegre, I'll be doing a talk in Curitiba. I'll be doing probably two talks at a high school, and then a more major event for college students, but also for some of the business community in the evening in Porto Alegre. And then I go to Buenos Aires, where we have another 2-day conference on objectivism in Buenos Aires. So it's been from the perspective of lectures and engagement and so on. Both Japan and Korea, and now here, have been very positive. So I'm excited for all of those. All right, let's jump to Vadim's question, just because it's a $300 question, so I'm going to give him priority. Vadim asks, before we get to kind of Putin and all that stuff, Vadim asks, I have a hard time convincing my wife that a photo picture is not art. The way I understand it is art is a concretization of an abstraction, as seen through a lens of human consciousness. The reverse process of concept formation versus a photo where portrayal portraits a reflection of light. Yes, art is a recreation of reality. It's a recreation of a reality that allows the artist, or that in a sense necessitate, whether the artist intends it or not, necessitates the artist bring his view of the world into the recreation. It's a manifestation of their view of the world, their sense of life, their, what Ayn Rand called, metaphysical value judgment. The value judgments about the most fundamental questions. The questions about the nature of reality, the questions about the relationship between you as a human being and reality. That gets reflected into the process of recreation. When you snap a photo, what the photographer is doing is choosing the frame, but in terms of the content of the frame, there's little in his control. At least that's true of I'd say, old style photography. There was some control. Obviously, you could do the setting, you can set the lighting. You could also in development make changes. But today, With Photoshop, you can actually make significant changes to a photograph, and you can embed it with your value and value judgments. You can make photos more like art. So I would say the photography has become in the hands of really creative and good photographers. Photography is becoming more like art than it was than it was of you just snapping a photo. The more control the photographer manifests in the photo, both in setting the frame in terms of setting the scene, and in terms of what they do post production in Photoshop, then the more art like it becomes. Where is that border when it shifts from one to the other? I think that's very hard to tell, and you would have to evaluate the photographer and the photographs to assess that. Some photographs are more reflective of an artist's metaphysical value judgments, and some photographs are more recreation than they are just representation. So it has to be a recreation of reality, not just reality. A photograph typically is just, here's a copy of reality. But the more we're changing that, the more we're controlling that, the more it becomes a recreation of reality. So I think the lines are blurring with some photographers and some photographs. And it's hard, I think, always to draw a clear line of okay, this is art and this is not when it comes to photographs. All right, let me also answer this $50 question from Wes, because it's on the topic we just discussed. Do you think it's too late for the rest of the world to do anything about North Korea? Do we just have to wait for it to collapse from the inside? Well, I mean, I don't think it's too late. I think it's too late because I think the rest of the world is weak and indecisive and pragmatic and inconsistent. I think, Trump illustrated this well with his groveling and his courtship of best buddies. What was it? Best buddies with the Buddha dictator of North Korea. But a world that was committed to it. I absolutely think they could do a lot with North Korea. For example, you could eviscerate their nuclear program. That is this idea that a nuclear North Korea is inevitable, that we just have to accept it, that we can't do anything. Why aren't we sabotaging it? Why aren't we making it clear the consequences to North Korea? Why aren't we doing everything we can to destroy their capacity to launch nuclear weapons? Why are we waiting for them just to have it? And I'm not talking about economic sanctions, which we have. That's not enough, and it's not good enough. What we need is to undermine them. The Israelis do a pretty good job of undermining the Iranian nuclear program. I don't get the same sense that the U.S. or the South Koreans are doing the same thing to the North Korean program. So I think the world needs to be and should be and can be much more aggressive about this. I also think, I've talked about this before, we could be knocking down their missiles when they do these tests. We could be using our anti-missile technology, which I hope South Korea has. I know the U.S. has. I know Israel has. I hope the Israelis have sold the South Koreans the Iron Dome. If not, then shame on them. And certainly the South Koreans should be buying it. But knock down every time they put up a missile, try to knock it down or shoot it down or show them that we're not afraid of them and we won't tolerate it. So there's a lot that the United States and the world could do to undermine North Korea and a North Korean regime, but we won't do it, right? Because we're scared. We don't believe in intervention. We don't believe in assassinating foreign leaders. We've lost our moral courage. We're afraid what will happen if they start bombing Seoul. So fear is dominant, and lack of confidence and lack of self-assuredness is dominant. I mean, the most ridiculous part of this is the fact that South Korea doesn't do it. South Korea has this massive incentive to do it, and it just it just basically accepts the existence of North Korea. It accepts the fact that they've got missiles aiming at Seoul. They accept the artillery there. They don't invest, I think, enough in their own military. They don't invest enough in undermining the North Koreans any way they can. So, yeah. All right, Thomas, just again because it's on topic and it's 100. Well, I guess it's only $20. It's 100 Brazilian reais, but we'll do it because it's on topic. Thomas asks, how do you see the future of Brazil if Lula is elected? And how do you see the future of the country if Bolsonaro is elected? I mean, look, Lula is a socialist, and so I think that his election would be unbelievably destructive to Brazil. I think it undermine prosperity in Brazil. It will reverse whatever economic positives legislation and positive things were done during the Bolsonaro's administration. Not much was done, but what was the little bit that was good will be reversed. But Lula is also a populist. He's not going to be. I don't think he's going to be. Completely destructive to the Brazilian economy. He wasn't the first term. Because I mean, he knows that in order to maintain his support, he's going to have to allow business enough freedom to be able to milk them for the benefits that he gains from them, so he can redistribute their wealth. So I think he's enough of a realist to do that. I don't think he puts Brazil on the path of Venezuela, but he very well might. I mean, you're playing with fire. You really are. Now, I think there's a real difference between Latin America broadly, including Brazil, and the United States. Brazil, the likelihood is that there's a much higher likelihood that Brazil gets taken over by rabid socialists, just like Venezuela, and the rest of Latin America gets taken over by rabid socialists, than there is that they get taken over by a right-wing authoritarianism. I think the dynamics, Latin America is primed for socialism, has been primed for socialism forever, primarily because of its continental philosophy, its Kantian leftist German philosophy. It never had, Latin America never had the benefit of, if you will, Anglo-Saxon philosophy, the liberal philosophy. There was more free markets. They never got the Enlightenment from England and from Scotland. They went straight to the French and the British, French and the Germans, and as a consequence, they're much more primed towards socialism in the left. So, I think Lula would be a disaster, and I think Bolsonaro will not be good, right? So the sad thing is that it's a terrible choice that Brazil is facing. Bolsonaro strikes me as pretty much of a kind of a bubbling idiot. With all the wrong instincts. He's a statist. He's a populist. He's a religionist. But he has put, if you will, the right people in the economic positions in the government. Oh, the other thing about Bolsonaro is he's super corrupt. So is Lula, right? Lula went to jail for corruption, and it still might win the election. So they're both super corrupt. But Bolsonaro has some good people kind of running the economy. So Brazil will probably do much better economically under under Bolsonaro. And but I don't see the prospects of the country very positive either way, because neither Lula nor Bolsonaro, are good in a significant way, and neither of them will. In Bolsonaro will not let the better elements in this government actually do the things that Brazil needs to get done in order for Brazil to become wealthy and successful and prosperous. It has all the potential for that, but it cannot do it because it's got a corrupt statist political system and economy. All right, we'll get to the other $20 questions, which are not on topic. We'll get to them. We'll get to them later. Okay, let me just do one other one, James G, because it's on Brazil, and this will be the last one before we get to talk about Putin and then Iran. How do you view Brazil in terms of its future? Do you like Sao Paulo? Do you feel it has potential to keep evolving to a better city? So again, Brazil's future is, I think, unfortunately bleak right now because both Bolsonaro and Lula are corrupt. Both of them are statist. Both of them are going to be bad for Brazil. I think Brazil has immense potential, always has had. The people are amazing. It has incredible natural resources. It has some very successful businessmen. It has a very entrepreneurial young people. Like every country, really, if you liberate it economically, it would do amazing. It has a large population, has a relatively young population, so it doesn't suffer from the demographic problems that much of the world suffers from. It's still relatively young, and it could do amazing things if the status got out of the way. And again, Paulo Guedes, who is the economy minister in Brazil, is a good guy. He has the right ideas. He's influenced by Ayn Rand. He's influenced by the Austrian economists, by Milton Friedman. If he was given a free hand, he could do amazing things, but hasn't so far. So I'm skeptical about Brazil's prospects. In terms of Sao Paulo is not my favorite city. It's a big city. It's not a particularly pretty city. Where my hotel is right now, a lot of tall buildings, a lot of very modern buildings, which are pretty cool, and it's a very nice part of town. We were at a restaurant earlier today, also to kind of a more expensive, nice part of town. But São Paulo is also full of favelas are the slums, full of slums, full of poverty. Again, crime is relatively high. São Paulo is just massive. It's just massive, and the traffic. Oh my God! It took an hour and 40 minutes to get from the hotel to my hotel. That shouldn't be more than 30 to 40 minutes without traffic, but traffic is horrific. They don't have the infrastructure to deal with the traffic. We don't have the highway system. There are just too many cars for the infrastructure that exists. It's just not a city. It's a city that needs a lot of infrastructure to improve. So I don't know how the city becomes better without massive investments in infrastructure. Now, looking out my window at the hotel, you can see some infrastructure going up, but is it enough? It's questionable. On the chat it says 12 million people live in Sao Paulo. I thought it was more than that, but yes, 12 million. I mean, my favorite city in Brazil is by far Rio de Janeiro, which is probably the most beautiful city in the world. But it's also got problems, crime, favelas, poverty. All of that is really difficult. But São Paulo has great restaurants. It's got a vibrant business community. There's a lot of wealth. There's a lot of wealthy people who live and work in São Paulo. So it's just a tough place to be because of the crime and because of the lack of infrastructure. So the traffic and all of that. All right. Let's see. All right. So just some news items quickly. We'll go over the news, including Russia and Iran. Just a quick news item that's just kind of funny. So this week, the head of the World Bank, David Malpass, was on a panel discussion, and he was asked about climate change, and he was asked, something about I don't know, the science of climate change, and he kind of hedged himself, and he kind of beat around the bush, and he wouldn't quite commit himself, and he wouldn't quite say exactly, wouldn't commit to the science. So like he was asked about these things, and he said, "Look, I'm not a scientist about human-caused global warming." So he hedged himself about not being a scientist and so on. The outcry was unbelievable. You'd think the guy had just denied the Holocaust or actually proposed genocide somewhere. So there were demands by Al Gore and others to have him fired from the World Bank. And anyway, just people flipped out over this comment by Malpass. Anyway, as a consequence of all the noise and everything, he came out and said, no, you misunderstood me. I'm not a climate denier, and absolutely we need to allocate funds to alternative energy, because he's been accused of not allocating enough of the World Bank funds to developing countries to deal with climate change and so on. So now he says, I'm not a denier. I'm not good at conveying the message. I spoke out of turn. All this stuff. He's backtracking like crazy. Sad to see, David Malpass, who's a decent economist and well respected in the field of economics. It's just sad to see these people cower before the climate change fascists and just silence themselves and refuse to even ask questions and refuse to accept challenges to the conventional wisdom around climate change. Even somebody smart like him just completely gives in to the kind of the zeitgeist, the prevailing views about climate change and everything else. So sad to see it. I wish these guys had a little bit of a backbone. Wouldn't that be refreshing and amazing? So sad. I mean, look, it's sad on the one hand. On the other hand, he's president of the World Bank. Why would anybody take a position like that? It's a position of a statist. It's a position there shouldn't be a World Bank. The World Bank should be dissolved. They shouldn't be redistributing wealth to third world countries. They shouldn't be trying to manipulate these countries by giving them loans below market prices. So the whole conception of the World Bank and the IMF, those organizations shouldn't exist. So the fact that he is president of the World Bank says a lot about him. The fact that he backtracked the way he did, and the fact that he folded the way he did, just I guess reinforces that perception. All right, let's get to some of the media news. All right, so as you know, we've been following the war in Ukraine. The big news following the significant Ukrainian victories in Russia, the significant pushback where the Russians basically had to fold and exit the whole province of Kharkiv, where the Ukrainians in a matter of days reoccupied that territory very quickly, and for devastating results for the Russians. I mean, not only were thousands of Russians killed, tens of thousands were captured, or thousands were captured, and probably tens of thousands basically taken out of the fight. But also hundreds of weapons were captured, from tanks to all kinds of, mobile, transportation vehicles, and not to mention weapons and shells and tank shells and just ammunition and everything else. All of that were captured by the Ukrainians, set back the Russians significantly, and I think it's emboldened the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are still kind of chipping away very, very slowly at Russian positions in the south. It's not clear when the Ukrainians, or if the Ukrainians can launch a significant push in the south. The Ukrainians also trying to push against the Russians in the northeast and around Lehman, I think it's called Lehman, and trying to basically get where the Russians have held it since 2014, really, and they're really well established and they're really well dug in. But other than that, it was a great few weeks for the Ukrainians in terms of just humiliating the mighty Russian army. The mighty Russian army. I mean, if anybody has any delusions about the Russian army, I think they're gone now. Putin's response to this last week was to announce a mobilization of forces, 300,000 reserves that had not been mobilized, add them, although I'm reading in some places that the way the Russian authorities have taken Putin's thing, it's not 300,000. They're actually trying to enlist somewhere around 1.2 million people. The consequence of this announcement that they were going to enlist a whole bunch of people and call up the reserves has been panic in Russia, a massive attempt at exodus, men who are eligible to be called up through this call up of the reserves, trying to exit the country, whether to places like Finland. Every ticket out of Moscow in an airplane was booked up. Airplanes full of males just trying to get out of the city, out of the country. But beyond that, we're just seeing also demonstrations in the streets, demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg and in many other cities around Russia. Also in the Caucasus or in some of the independent, autonomous regions of Russia where ethnic minorities control it, and they are there trying to, refusing in a sense to cooperate with the Moscow authorities in terms of enlisting people. They're saying, what have these Russians done for us lately? As I predicted, there's more and more talk about some of these ethnic groups trying to establish autonomy. The Chechens, for example, Chechens have fought 2 wars with Russia, lost them, but have fought 2 bloody wars against Russia to try to establish the independence for which they were lost. The Chechens, who are led by a guy who is very, very much an ally of Putin, but this guy's basically said, we're not going to pay any attention to this call up. We're not going to enlist people. We're not going to play ball with the people in Moscow. We're holding back for now. We want to see if the Kremlin is serious about this. And again, I think what could happen is you could see an internal breakup of Russia from the inside. You can see the Chechens trying to fight for their independence. You can see some of these other ethnic groups trying to fight for their independence, and Russia kind of imploding from the inside. But Putin is obviously in an unbelievably weak position. Everything he has argued, everything he has claimed, everything he has stood for is really collapsed. The regime thought that they could take out the Ukrainians in 3 days. They thought they would be able to take Kiev and replace Zelensky with a pro-Russian president to just get on with life. I don't think Russia thought they would have to permanently occupy vast territories in order for them to succeed in this war. I don't think the Russians expected to lose anywhere between 50 to 80,000 soldiers, either through death or through just injury. I don't think the Russians thought they would be humiliated on the battlefield. I don't think they thought they would lose as many tanks and as many armored vehicles as they have, and many airplanes. I mean, in every sense, this has been devastating for Russia. But beyond that, I don't think the Russians thought that as a consequence of this war, Finland and Sweden would join NATO, which I think is probably the most devastating of all the consequences for Russia. I mean, the fact is that they went into Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Well, they got a lot worse than that. They got much more powerful enemies now in Finland and Sweden, now committed to NATO. long border with Russia, two countries that have militaries that are far more powerful than the Ukrainian military. So this has been a devastating, and of course the Russian economy has been devastated. They've had a massive brain drain, and now they're losing even more. Primarily men leaving Russia, so it's an even greater brain drain on the Russian economy. So Russia's struggling. Putin is struggling. All of his actions now out of desperation. Of course, as part of the mobilization, Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons. That again is an act of ultimate desperation. I don't know this for a fact, but I certainly hope that the generals within the Russian army and others surrounding Putin will refuse to launch nuclear weapons, even if Putin is crazy and suicidal enough to actually do it. I think there are probably people around him who will stop him. Maybe not, which is kind of spooky and scary, but I guess it is possible that we will see the use of a tactical nuclear bomb in Russia. All we're seeing is a desperate regime, a regime desperate for attention, a regime desperate for some form of victory, a regime desperate for soldiers, for weapons, for anything. This is a regime, of course, buying weapons from the Iranians and the North Koreans, of all people. That's their allies now. That's how isolated Russia has become. The Chinese, while somewhat sympathetic to the Russians, won't give them weapons and are not sharing, military technology with them. The Indians are not giving them weapons and military technology. Both countries are buying oil and gas, primarily oil, from Russia, but they're not militarily supporting them. So what you're seeing is Russia further isolated, further desperate, Putin not knowing where to turn to, not willing to give up, he can't admit defeat, so just becoming more and more desperate. And of course, the fear is, and the real risk is that as he becomes more and more and more desperate, that he becomes more and more of a risk of actually launching, actually launching a nuclear attack. Jeff asks, and again, I'm jumping to Jeff just because he's asking a question about the topic we're talking about right now. So Jeff says, Putin and everyone is evil for initiating conscription. Zelensky did the same thing. It was terrible watching Ukrainian men fighting age, having to leave their families at the border and go back to defend their country. It was, although those pictures, many of them were doing it voluntarily. Some of them obviously were not. But yes, conscription is awful. It's horrific. It's anti-individual rights. It's evil. But again, I wouldn't compare a country doing it out of a sense of desperation and self-defense and a country doing it in order to invade another country. So conscription is evil and bad. It's evil and bad in Ukraine. It's evil and bad in Israel. I served 3 years under conscription, so I know personally the evil of it and the damage it does to and the wasted time and life. The only good thing to come out of my army service is that I met my wife there. But it's evil in Israel. It's horrible in Israel. And one of the things we do in Israel is Boaz Arad, who runs the Ayn Rand Center Israel and who is a good friend of mine, has been a friend of mine since the early 80s. One of his programs as part of the Ayn Rand Center is a program about privatization of the Israeli military and ending the draft and embracing a private professional army for Israel. He's got some former generals on his side. He has testified in the Knesset and everywhere else. So I do not think Israel is an exception. Absolutely, I think Israel should eliminate the draft. I've said this many times, so this is not something new. If you know anything about me, you know I'm against a draft everywhere, so it's just another knock against some people on the chat who are trying to attribute to me ideas that I don't have. I've always said that a country that cannot raise a voluntary army to defend itself is a country that does not deserve to exist. I think that is true of Ukraine. I think that is true of Israel. I think that is true of every country. So it is evil of all these countries, but it is, if you will, more evil when you're raising that army in order to invade another country, in order to initiate force. The initiation of force is just horrific, because then you're not only doing damage to your own people by initiating force against them and conscripting them, then you're putting them in real harm's way, and you're initiating that, and you're putting everybody else in harm's way. You're putting everybody you're attacking in harm's way as well. So the real evil here is on the Russian side. Although yes, conscription is evil, no question about it. All right, let's keep going. I'm encouraged to see, and I keep getting more encouraged to see more and more the resistance in Russia to the mobilization, to the conscription, to forcing people to join the military. I don't know if you know this, but some of the anti-war protesters, it's like in England in I think the 18th century, sometimes the sailors would kidnap people and enlist them in the army, and they would be part of the Navy. If you were drunk or something like this, they would enlist you. What's happening right now in Russia is some of these anti-war demonstrations. They're literally taking people off the streets and forcing them into military uniforms. They're forcing them into the military as punishment for being anti-war. Of course, these are not going to be motivated soldiers. These are not going to be successful soldiers. These are going to be just cannon fodder. So it's horrible and tragic, but it's not going to solve Putin's problem. Putin's problems are far deeper than having more bodies. He doesn't have enough trained soldiers. He doesn't have enough motivated soldiers. He doesn't have enough people who actually motivate to win. He has lousy strategy. He has lousy generals. He has lousy weapon systems. I mean, the Russian military is incompetent, and having another 300,000 troops is not going to change the fact that they're incompetent. Russian soldiers are unmotivated to fight. Having 300,000 additional unmotivated soldiers is not going to change the outcome. Russia is in trouble, through and through. In every aspect of this, Russia is in a disaster zone for itself. Troy, thank you. Troy waiting in to get us over the 650 target. Really appreciate it, Troy, with 500 Australian dollars. That's great. Thank you. And you can ask a question sometime. But it's great to have your support. Just disaster for Russia. What can we say? Disaster for Putin. But Putin's in a corner. He's becoming more and more desperate, which does not bode well for anybody, particularly for the Russians. The Russians are going to be the biggest victims of all of this, and the Russians are already suffering. I wish countries like America opened doors to anybody fleeing Russia right now. Imagine the brain drain out. I was just talking to somebody here in Brazil who was living in Tbilisi for a few months, and he said he had to leave Tbilisi because so many Russians had moved to Tbilisi to get away from Russia and away from Putin and away from the devastating economic consequence of what Putin's doing. They moved to Tbilisi, and they've driven rents so high that nobody else can afford rents in Tbilisi. So Russians are going to places like Tbilisi, Georgia. They're going to places like Turkey. But what would be great is if Western Europe and the United States opened its doors to fleeing Russians and brought that talent to where it can best manifest itself. But our immigration policy is so pathetic and ridiculous. That's not going to happen. All right, so that's kind of Putin's mobilization and its devastating effect. The other big story, I think, of the last week has been what's going on in Iran. I don't know if you've been following this, but again, horrible and inspiring at the same time. Last week, or maybe it's more than a week ago now, in Iran, there are these religious commandments, the religious laws. The women in public have to be covered. They have to cover their hair. They have to cover their face. But their hair has to be covered. I think the face can be reveals they don't have to literally wear hijab, but the hair has to be covered completely, and it's against the law. And if the women don't cover their hair, they can get arrested. And this young woman, 22 years old, was a Kurdish woman, so from the northwest of Iran, the Kurdish section of Iran, was visiting Tehran, and had her hair covering, but supposedly didn't cover enough of the hair, according to the religious police in Tehran. She was arrested, and it turns out that she, at the police station, was beaten and ultimately beaten to death. The Iranians claim that she had some kind of heart attack. This was a healthy young woman. No reason for her to have a heart attack. Maybe she did die of a heart attack, but because she was beaten basically into death, into her body basically failing, all because she didn't cover a few strands of hair. The response started out in the Kurdish area of Iran. The Kurds are, of course, a minority within Iran. It's an oppressed minority pretty much everywhere in the Middle East. There's a massive Kurdish population after World War I, when the France and the English divvied up the Middle East, the one ethnic group they didn't allocate a country to, the one big ethnic group, tens of millions of people, they didn't allocate a country to, were the Kurds. And there is a very large population of Kurds in Iran, a very, very large population of Kurds in Turkey, and a very large population of Kurds in Syria and in Iraq. And in Iraq, they have some autonomy that they have basically won through battle. But in Turkey, they've been trying to carve out their own states, and Turkey has declared them terrorists, the Kurdish independence movement. And of course, you know about the Kurds in Syria because Trump betrayed them. They were the ones who helped the Americans defeat ISIS, and then Trump basically said to Erdogan, the authoritarian in Turkey, "Yeah, you can come into Iraq, Syria, and take the Kurds and kill the Kurds." But anyway, the Kurds have a real presence in Iran, and I did a whole show on how he betrayed them, so you can go back and find the show on just horrible. I mean, or you could read what's his name, his advisor, his national security advisor's account of how he betrayed the Kurds in his book. I forget the name now again of John Bolton, who I saw in Korea. John Bolton has a great account of how Trump, on a phone call, randomly, in spite of Bolton arguing against it, Trump just stabbed the Kurds in the back. But again, I'm putting that aside. I did a whole show on it when it happened. Anyway, the Kurds in northwest Iran, there were massive demonstrations about this woman who had been killed and had family in that area, and they were obviously super upset and incensed about the fact that she had been murdered. Well, those demonstrations now spread initially to Tehran and now to all the major cities in Iran and beyond. So they've spread beyond the major cities to smaller cities. These are some of the largest demonstrations, probably larger than the ones in 2019, and maybe even as large or larger than the ones in 2009. In 2019, the demonstrations were primarily economic, about the economic hardships that were placed on Iran because of the sanctions. Nothing came of that. The 2009 demonstrations were massive. That was around a stolen election, that people felt that the election was stolen, that a moderate should have won instead of Ahmadinejad, who was a much more consistent religionist, hard right religionist. And in 2009, there was a real, I think, opportunity to have overthrown the regime and really to make a dent in the regime's power. And the Obama administration just was pathetic. It could have supported it. It could have supported both with moral courage. It could have smuggled weapons in. It could have done a lot of things, but they did very little, if anything. They were too busy negotiating a nuclear deal with the Iranians, and they didn't pay attention to this real pro, at least to some extent, pro freedom, at least to some extent, freedom in Iran, an anti the clerical regime. Anyway, that opportunity was lost, maybe lost forever, but there might be an opportunity right now. I mean, the demonstrations right now are unique. They're about freedom. They're about the treatment of women. You're seeing things that you've never seen before in Iran. You're seeing people fighting back against the police. You're seeing them beating up the police. You're seeing women burning their hijabs. You're seeing them taking out and putting them in the street and burning them and being cheered on by men for doing that. So, these are not the same conservative men of the past. This is a different generation. This is the generation from the last 20 years who've grown up under this theocratic regime, don't believe in this theocracy, and are finally fighting back. You're seeing women. There was some video of a woman in the middle of these demonstrations cutting her hair, which is short, which is against illegal, and without hair covering in public, and that being cheered on by men. You're seeing the demonstrations spread. You're seeing it being led by women. In 2019, they're estimating that the regime killed 1,500 people in order to quell the demonstrations. So far, the regime has not been as violent, so only by official measures, maybe 30, 40, 50 people have been killed. We'll see if this spreads and becomes worse. But we will see. This is worth watching. The president of Iran, who is a real conservative, real theocratic conservative, Iranian, Mullah, has come out and said, we're going to crush this. So you can expect an escalation of violence in Iran. We'll see whether the demonstrators keep fighting back. We'll see whether this gets outside of the control of the local police. We'll see if they have to bring in the military and troops and the National Guard. This could get ugly and horrific. One of the more positive things that have happened is that Iran shut down the internet. So they've blocked all internet access in Iran. So what happened was the Biden administration, this is to their credit, the Biden administration said, okay, we know we have sanctions against Iran, but anybody who wants to sell equipment into Iran for them to get internet access, so any connection with Iranians for the purpose of giving them access to the internet, we're releasing that from sanctions. So we're eliminating the sanctions. Immediately, and I think this was coordinated with Elon Musk, immediately Elon Musk said that he is activating Starlink over Iran, and they're going to try to smuggle in, and they're going to try to sell into Iran the dishes, right? Starlink dishes. So they're going to try to get internet access to the Iranians. And again, this was facilitated by the Biden administration releasing, because Musk couldn't have done it without the Biden administration saying, we won't prosecute Musk for providing services in Iran because of the sanctions. So let's hope we can get a bunch of satellite equipment into the Iranians, into the demonstrators, let them get dishes. One of the things that's happening is the Iranians now have learned from the Arab Spring, from other demonstrations around the world. They learned how to use social media. They've learned how to use their phones. That's part of the reason why the regime has shut down the internet. But you don't need the internet. There are a lot of apps now that don't need the internet in order to communicate between apps. I forget how it works, but it's phone to phone to phone to phone. So they create networks of the phones without having to connect to a server to the internet itself. So they're using those technologies to coordinate the demonstrations. If they get Starlink, they can elevate that even better. Anyway, to be watched. Let's see if the Biden administration rises to the challenge. Let's see if the West supports them. Again, the Biden administration is in this position where they're negotiating a nuclear treaty with Iran. Maybe they don't want to upset the mullahs too much. Maybe they're silent about it. I guess it's a mesh network, Enric. Yes. So let's see what happens. But my hope is that somebody will stand up and call this and actually embolden the Iranians not just to demonstrate in the street, but to overthrow the regime. I mean, that is Iran is an amazing country. The Iranian people, amazing people. They've always been the intellectuals of the Middle East. When the Arabs first conquered the entire Middle East after Muhammad and spread Islam everywhere. Well, the people who ran the caliphates, the people who ran the Arab Empire were the Persians. The caliph, the top guy might have been an Arab because he had to be a descendant of Muhammad, but the people who actually ran things were the Persians. Of course, being intellectual also makes you open to bad ideas, so that they also take their religion more seriously than others do. But let's hope. But there's also a strong secular movement within Iran. There's strong secular forces within Iran that were established there by the Shah, and there's a lot of Iranians who has been exposed to the West, and you can see that in the demonstrators and these women that have had enough of it. If they could overthrow this regime, I mean, Iran, you'd immediately have a dramatic decrease in the price of oil. Gas prices would tumble. Iran has vast, reserves of oil they can't get to because they don't have Western technology to go and actually drill for it. Iran becoming a more westernized country would change the Middle East in such a dramatic fashion. It would change the global situation. It would have, global strategic implications that are massive and all positive. So, for all kinds of reasons, for the sake of the people in Iran and for all of our sake, we should do whatever we can to promote liberty and freedom in Iran. Short of, and my argument was we should bomb the hell out of every piece of this regime's autocratic infrastructure. So to help the demonstrators, we should support the demonstrators explicitly. That won't happen. But given that won't happen, maybe we can support them in covert ways, or maybe we support them in morally. I think this is the one regime where the United States is justified in, and indeed should be actively, militarily, covertly, whatever way is most efficient, active in undermining the regime and destroying it, whether it's assassinating the supreme leader, whether it's bombing the Homs, which is the center of learning. But yes, we should be actively helping the Iranian people bring about regime change in Iran. All right, so I think we're caught up on the big stories. There are plenty of more stories going on. Trump is in big legal trouble. He's got at least four different legal cases where he could be indicted in any one of them, maybe in all of them. Doesn't seem to prevent him from wanting to run for president. Maybe it's going to encourage him because he'll get immunity. And it doesn't seem to prevent people from supporting him. But it is interesting to watch the indictment. Of course, he's got the big case in New York where he's indicted for fraud, for defrauding. It's a civil case against him for defrauding the banks by misstating the value of his property to get cheap mortgages. No, I don't think the indictment against Trump is an indictment of the justice system. I think the indictment against the fact that Trump is unbelievably corrupt. I think the case in Georgia is completely legitimate. He tried to interfere, tried to reverse the election. He legally put pressure on election officials to try to reverse a legitimate election. I think in New York, he committed fraud. He basically pled the fifth. Everybody within his organization pled the fifth. Why? Because they don't have an answer, because it's well documented that he committed fraud against the banks there. I think he took classified material home for no good reason, and the Justice Department is absolutely within their right to go after him for that. No, and then of course January 6th and his inciting and the way he acted in that on every front. Yes, absolutely, they should go after him. They're justified in going after him. He is, if not the most corrupt president we've ever had, very close to it. So, yeah, every single one of these cases is, I think, on solid ground. All right, let's see. Let's do some of these super chat. Wow, at $930. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Troy, again. Really appreciate everybody's support. Let's see. We got a bunch of $20 questions, I think. Yeah, and thank you, Thomas. And let's see. All right. Jupiter asks, do you think William F. Buckley was intimidated by Ayn Rand? As far as I can tell, he never had her as a guest on Firing Line. No, he never had her as a guest on Firing Line. He generally, he tried to, in a sense, he tried to subvert any attempt to give her a platform. He tried to undermine her at every point he could. He is the one who actually got Chamberlain to write the horrible review of Atlas Shrugged that he published in the National Review. He basically tried to make sure that, as a good conservative that he was, as a good religious conservative that he was, that she was marginalized within the conservative movement, and he would never give her a platform. So he wouldn't invite her on Firing Line for exactly that reason. Firing Line would have given her a platform for her ideas, and he was trying to undermine everything about her platform. At the same time, he was fascinated by her. He was super curious about her. You could argue, semi-stalked her. The evidence of that will come out one day. And yes, I think he was very much intimidated by her. He knew that she was the enemy. She was the enemy of his form of conservatism, and she was the real alternative to the left. But he wouldn't embrace that because she undermined everything he believed in. So Buckley was a wimp when it came to Ayn Rand. Again, there will be evidence to show that. And it's funny because when she died, he said something like, with her death, her ideas die, everything dies. She will not be remembered in the future. Who do you think is going to be remembered more in the future? Even today, who is more well known today? William F. Buckley or Ayn Rand? I mean, it's no contest. Her books sell gazillion times more than any book he sells. Within a generation, he will be forgotten. Ayn Rand will be remembered for the ages. For the ages. So William F. Buckley was a pompous, was a pompous fool. As Ayn Rand said, he was super intelligent, but too intelligent to be as religious as he was. And he was not just religious; he was an advocate for religion. So he in some sense created the modern conservative movement, and has destroyed it and handed it now. His whole way of thinking, handed it over to the National Conservatives, who, by the way, had their annual conference last week on September, I think, 11th, 12th, that weekend. I will be talking about the videos are coming out from that conference, so we'll be able to look at some of those videos and analyze them, and I'll be talking about National Conservatives in that context in the weeks to come. Daniel says, what is your view on Joseph McCarthy? He was a staunch anti-communist. He was a staunch anti-communist, and that's to his credit. But he took it way too far. He was willing to violate people's freedom of speech. He was willing to go after people not just for membership in the Communist Party, let's say, but also for for their ideas, for what they stood for. I think what Congress did around the McCarthy hearing was witch hunting. I think it was bad for freedom of speech, for the freedom to hold ideas. I think Ayn Rand testified, but she testified reluctantly. She was not in support of what they were doing, but she saw it as an opportunity to reveal to the world the extent to which communism had impacted Hollywood, and that was her motivation. But she didn't think that it was right for the government to get involved in telling Hollywood what ideas they should be projecting in their movies. Bree asks, Google won't let me send my message concerning the correct course of action for the U.S., Israel, concerning Iran. Use your imagination and comment. I'm not sure why Google's not letting you do it. I just said what I think. My lectures where I call for the bombing, for giving Iran the infrastructure its philosophy deserves, which basically means the Stone Age, all on YouTube. Nobody has restricted access to them. They're probably suppressed by the algorithm, but nobody has taken them down. Nobody has stopped them. And I've been talking about Iran since September 11th. Leonard Peikoff has been talking about Iran since 1989, since the Salman Rushdie affair in 1989. Nobody's taken down any of those comments, those videos, those suggestions, those articles. It's all still up on the web and all can be found. And Google has not suppressed any of that. So maybe there's some algorithm that doesn't allow you to say certain things in a super chat. But Joe asks, I thought you once mentioned a school in Colorado that your friend runs. What school in what city? Yeah, I spoke at a school in Colorado, but I can't remember the name of the school. It's north of Denver. It's a charter school which is run by a former congressman who I know really well, and whose name, of course, has escaped me, and who has become more and more pro-free markets as he's been exposed more and more to my talks and my lectures, and is very good on most issues. He is religious, but the school is very good. It's got a classical program, a classical education focus, and it gets the highest scores in tests in the state. But I don't remember the name of the town, or it's north of Denver, or the name of the school. You're going to have to ask me again sometime and jog my memory. Or send me an email, and I'll be able to find all the information. I have it somewhere. Thomas asks, did you read in Barry Weiss's Substack the article about Paulina noting about violent crime and gangs in Sweden, particularly involving immigrants from Islamic countries? It was very depressing. Yes, I did read it, and it is very depressing. But what was interesting in the article was she never mentioned Islam. She never said they were immigrants of Muslim countries. It was all if you know anything about Sweden, you know that that's what she's talking about. But she never actually says it. And what's depressing about it, other than, of course, the horror of these gangs and the horror of the fact that they are behaving in this way and they are as violent as they are. What's depressing about it is that she doesn't really discuss the causes of it. And I'd say the causes of it are three. One, the barbaric culture from which they came, but that can be overcome. You can overcome the same Muslims who come to the United States don't behave in that way. So what is Sweden doing wrong? Well, the primary thing they're doing wrong is they're not assimilating them. They're not requiring them to work. They're not requiring them to become productive members of Swedish society. They hand them welfare checks, even if they don't work, even if they don't try to find a job, so a significant number of these Muslim immigrants who live in these neighborhoods don't have jobs, and yet the Swedish government continues to send them checks. So You cannot have the kind of Swedish welfare system or the kind of German welfare system where you encourage people not to integrate, not to assimilate, not to become part of your workforce. Because a big part of the way people assimilate, a big part of the way people become part of your culture is through work. So they're not required to work. So they're never going to assimilate. So they keep their barbaric culture. But on top of that, the police don't enforce the law. This is what happened in the UK with the Pakistani Muslim gangs that were raping young girls, and the police didn't enforce the law. They knew about this, and they didn't do anything about it. And it's just mind-boggling. They didn't do anything about it because they were afraid to offend the Muslims. So this is a sense in which you can't judge Muslim immigration today because the West is so pathetic. We won't enforce laws about rape. We won't enforce laws about raping young girls. We won't enforce laws about violence, about murder, about bombings, about intimidation, about violent crime, because we're afraid to offend the Muslims. Well, of course they'll take over if that's your argument. It's not immigration that's the problem. It's that we won't live up to our own standards. If we demanded that they live up, that they become civilized, otherwise they will spend the rest of their life in jail, then they would have no choice. If we demanded that they work, then they would work and they would become part of the culture. But if we don't let them work and we don't enforce our laws with regard to them, then we've accepted their barbarism as the starting point and the end point. And therefore they will stay barbarians. So I believe that you can change people and you can assimilate people and you can integrate people, but you have to do it. You have to actively pursue that, and you have to be aggressive about it. And you have to start by declaring unequivocally the superiority of your culture and demand that they become civilized. And if they don't, that's okay. Every time they commit a crime, they go to jail and they stay there. And you have to not just enforce the law, but enforce the law vigorously. And as the crime increases, become more brutal about enforcing the law and extend sentences and do whatever you can to stop this, right? So that's what's missing in Sweden. That's what's was missing in the UK. I think they're better now. That's what's missing in France. Although the crime and again, it's funny because as bad as the crime is in Sweden, violent crime in Sweden is still lower than violent crime in many, many, many U.S. cities. Without big Muslim populations. So, but it's sad what's happening in Sweden. It's very sad, and but it's the Swedes' fault, not for allowing immigrants, but for treating them the way they treat them, with kid gloves, and by by basically groveling before them and allowing them to get away with all this. All right, theme master. How much do you think this revolution in Iran would squash the term transphobic? God, I don't understand the question. How much do you think this revolution in Iran would squash the term transphobic? I don't know what that means. Look, I don't think that this revolution in Iran is a revolution that would bring about the kind of culture we have in the West. I think they probably are still probably still don't like trans and reject trans and discriminate against trans, even the people in the streets. But so I don't think this is a revolution that would embrace the trans nuttiness that is going on in the West. But I do think this I think it's much healthier, and it's a revolution that actually wants freedom. Healthier and unhealthier at the same time. I mean, I also think they probably discriminate against trans, which I don't believe we should. Charles says, speaking of Persians, did you manage to get Rumi's kitchen to get to Rumi's kitchen Persian food in Washington D.C. during Ocon? They had fantastic kebab. I did not, unfortunately. I did not make it to that restaurant. I wasn't that impressed with the restaurants I did make it to in D.C. Jeff asks, I've pre-ordered Freedom's Furies by Timothy Sandfer. Looking forward to his insights on Isabel Patterson, Rose Walker Lane, and Ayn Rand. They were friends who disagreed at times. Do you have any comments about this? No, I mean, I don't know much about it, but it's not that they disagreed sometimes. They had a falling out. They were friends who then had a schism. They actually fell out and they stopped talking to one another. So it should be an interesting book. I don't know the history that well about everything, but certainly there was a period in which they were quite close. They communicated extensively and they influenced one another's thinking in significant ways. So, yeah, it should be a good read. Gail said, all the best to your wife and home in Puerto Rico. Thank you. And in my wife's name, thank you, Gail. I appreciate it. We appreciate it. All right, let's see. Those are $20 questions. We're at $979.62. How about we go, well, we just got another $2, but how about we go over 1,000? So we need another $20, $19. If anybody wants to ask a $20 question. Okay, Anne asks, what's the basis to say a conflict resolution process is cultish? Wasn't Barney suggesting it for air right versus objectivism? Have schisms hurt the movement? Look, I don't want to discuss Carl Barney on the show, so don't ask me about it. I don't want to discuss his idea about conflict resolution, so I'm not going to discuss it. Have schisms hurt the movement? No, I think I've said this before. Bad people with bad ideas have hurt the movement. People who have distorted ideas around objectivism have hurt the movement. People who claim objectivism is an open system have hurt the movement. People who don't present objectivism very well have hurt the movement. Schisms help the movement. Schisms make it clear the differences between people. Schisms make it clear why some people are wrong. Schisms help define what objectivism is and what objectivism can be and should be. So I think schisms are a good thing, not a bad thing for any movement. Every movement has them. There's nothing about objectivism that's special. About objectivism. Some are personal because I said this early on. I said, if you expect me to march up a hill into battle, and this is an intellectual battle that requires immense resources, personal, emotional, intellectual, energy-wise, if you expect me to charge up the hill to take the enemy with people I don't like, it ain't happening. It's demotivating. So let them go charge their hill, and I'll charge my hill. That is this idea that, I have to sacrifice for the cause by associating myself with people I don't like, people I don't respect, people who I think are harmful to me and to the movement, is absurd. So I am all for all kinds of schisms. I have no problem with them. I think they're good for a movement. They better define objectivism, but they also are motivating, right? Because now the people I am fighting with are people I've chosen to fight with. And maybe one day people will kick me out of some movement. I don't know. You remember the schisms goes both ways, right? Both sides are schisming from one another. And that's fine. There's certain people I don't want to be associated with. I don't want to fight with. I don't want to be in battle with. They're not my teammates. I don't want them on my team. They can go do their own thing. They can fight the battle as they see fit. But I need to be motivated to do this job that I do. It's hard. It requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of fighting with the world out there. And I need to know that the team I have fighting with me is the team the team that I trust. I don't want people who are going to stab me in the back. I don't want people who are going to question in a destructive way everything that is being done. I don't want people who are going to undermine the things that I'm doing. That is demotivating. So if schisms help motivate, great. So Leonard Peikoff told me years and years ago, schisms are good for the movement. And I have, over time, come to agree with them. And I think AOI wrote a paper about schisms, and I basically agree with that paper. But I'm fine with not working with people you don't like. I'm fine with not working with people who you think are distorting the message of your philosophy. I'm fine with people not working with people who have a different strategy than yours to make change. They can do their own thing. I'm fine with not working with people for a variety of different reasons. That's what schism means. And I'm fine with not working with people who think I'm a monster. Why would I work with people who think I'm a bad guy? Why would I work with people who I think are bad guys? So it boggles my mind, this idea that we all have to get along, kumbaya, because we're fighting an enemy. But if we're in the trenches fighting an enemy, the people in the trench with you have to be people you trust, have to be people you want to fight with, have to be people that are going to motivate you, not demotivate you. Anyway, I've answered this question a million times, and I'm really sick of it. All right, Al, thank you, really appreciate it. Jeff, thank you, really appreciate it. You both have taken us over the $1,000. Thank you for that. And no reason to stop, by the way. We can keep going. Okay, James asks, does it make sense for Germany to take in so many refugees from Russia? Germany has a lot of Ukrainians. Will these two refugee groups end up fighting? No, I think they'll end up getting along. Russians and Ukrainians get along great. They have a very similar language. They have a very similar culture. Individual Russians and individual Ukrainians, this attitude of Russians and Ukrainians and will they get along in Germany is a tribalist mentality. But there's nothing tribal. It's not about tribes. It's about individuals. And indeed, as these people come to Germany, and if they work in Germany, they'll be integrated into German society. They'll become more German. And who cares where they came from? Who cares where they came from? So the challenge for Germany is, just collect welfare checks. And that's true of Muslim immigrants, and that's true of Ukrainian immigrants, and that's true of Russian immigrants. Right? So the extent to which these groups fight, it's because they have, in the U.S., the Irish and the Italians used to fight all the time, and there's a period in which they still immigrant groups still hold on to their tribal beliefs, but you've got to break that up, and the way to break that up is by integrate them into your society. And you shouldn't assume people are tribal. You should assume people are individual, and you should treat them as individuals. And if they turned out to be uncivilized, and then you deal with them as you deal with uncivilized people. But no, I mean, there's a vast history of Ukrainians and Russians getting along. Daniel, thank you. Paulo, thank you. These are all contributions without questions. Thank you. All right. Why are most of us only attracted to the opposite sex when someone of the same sex could share our highest values? Well, because there's a sense in which what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, is to be attracted to the opposite sex. There's a sense in which that at least that inclination is wired into us. And it's wired into us for obvious reasons, because biologically we're geared towards reproduction. The real question is, why are some people attracted to the same sex? That's the real question. Because sex is not about your highest intellectual values. Sex is about the other sex. So the real question is, why do you have homosexuality? Why is that a thing? And to what extent is it there is an element of biology there? To what extent is it choices that people make and why they make their choices, by what standard they make those choices when they're young, before they're really fully conscious of the consequences of the choices that they make. So we know that a majority of people are attracted to opposite sex. That's completely understandable given the way we're wired by evolution. And evolution does wire us in certain ways, at least with potentialities. You become aware of the opposite sex and sexually attracted to the opposite sex pretty early. Pretty early. Part of it is that's the culture around you. Partially is it's biology. And then the real question is, and I don't know that we have an answer, is why are some people not? So that's the best I can do on that one. Frank asks, if climate change is caused by man, then shouldn't activists blame Saddam Hussein for all those oil fires that burned for weeks and made the sky black? Yeah, but you see, Saddam Hussein wouldn't have had the oil wells if not for Western companies who dug them, and if not for Western countries who consume them. So, you can't ever blame the primitive, barbaric societies. The blame is always has to be placed on the more advanced, on the West. The successful are always to blame. That's what altruism demands. So you can't blame Saddam for the unquenching thirst for oil that the West exhibits. That's how altruism. That's how it forces. That's how it causes them to think. Catherine asks, "Did you try the kimchi and how was it?" I had some kimchi. I didn't have as much kimchi as I would have liked. I didn't go to any restaurants that specialized in kimchi. I would have liked to have gone to places that had more sophisticated kimchi and different variations. Maybe next time I go to Korea, I'll try to find a place. But I got taken to the same steakhouse twice in Korean kind of barbecue where you order the meat and then you grill it on a little thing in front of you on the table. And that they had kimchi there, and I ate all of it. I love kimchi. And then the breakfast buffet had stuff like kimchi. It was fermented like kimchi. It wasn't actually cabbage, but it was other stuff that fermented. I love that stuff. So, pickled and fermented and all that kind of stuff. I love it. So I eat a lot of stuff. Frank says, with all that smoke went in there, it did. And they said it did cause climate change, but they blamed the consumers of oil, not the producers of oil. Theme Master says, I meant to say Islamophobic instead of transphobic in that question about Iran, but I still don't know what that means. I still don't know what the question actually means. Maybe if you want to clarify the question, that would be good. All right, this is the last question. So if anybody wants to jump in with a super chat question, now is the time. This is the last question, and then we will go on. Just about superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet looks very interesting. Yes, I know one of the authors. I'm going to try to get him on the show, interview him. I'm a huge supporter of the thesis, or at least a big chunk of the thesis. So it is exciting. It's exciting to see more people advocating for superabundance, advocating for progress, advocating for the huge success that we've had. So all good. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. Let's see. Any parting words? No, other than we'll have a show tomorrow. It'll probably be around the same hour, maybe an hour earlier, but it'll be tomorrow at about the same hour and in the same hotel. So I have a good internet connection here. It's decent. It's not as good as Korea, but it's decent. So I'll do a show. After that, I'm not sure because I'm on the road. I'll be in Curitiba and Porto Alegre. We'll see what the internet connection is there, and then in São Paulo, and then in Buenos Aires. So I'll try to do as many shows as I can this week. Tomorrow's show is going to be a Iran's Rules for Life. So I'll do a Iran's Rules for Life. I'm behind on those. I think I owe two this month. So I'll do one tomorrow, sometime around this time, sometime in the early evening East Coast time. All right. Thanks Thanks everybody. Really appreciate it. It's great that we got well over our targets. So we've made up for some lost days where we didn't have shows. Really appreciate it. I will see you all tomorrow. And yeah, have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.